The sting of the leather belt across her back drew a sharp gasp from Violet's lips, but she refused to give her stepfather the satisfaction of hearing her cry. Blood trickled down her spine as she stared at the wooden floorboards of the ramshackle cabin she'd called home for the past 8 years. Ever since her mother died when she was 12, leaving her at the mercy of a man who saw her as nothing but a burden and free labor. "Worthless girl," he slurred, the stench of cheap whiskey filling the small room. "Can't even fetch water without dawdling. Think I don't know you were talking to that shopkeeper's boy again." Violet bit her lip until she tasted blood. At 20, she was a woman grown, yet Frank Holloway treated her like property. The year was 1875, and in this dusty corner of the Arizona Territory, a man's home was his castle, and what happened inside was nobody's business. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words hollow from years of repetition. Frank spat on the floor. "Get dinner ready. And don't think I didn't see you hiding that money. You think you're saving up to leave? Ain't nobody want damaged goods like you." As he stumbled out to the porch, Violet rose shakily and moved to the stove. Her fingers trembled as she stoked the fire. The hiding place beneath the loose floorboard in her tiny room held almost $15 now, money she'd scraped together over months of secretly selling eggs and the occasional embroidered handkerchief in town when Frank was too drunk to notice. One more month, she promised herself. One more month of hell, and she'd have enough to buy passage on the stagecoach heading east. To a place where nobody knew her, where she could start fresh. The next morning dawned bright and merciless, the summer sun already scorching despite the early hour. Frank had passed out on the porch, and Violet seized the opportunity to hurry through her chores. The well was a quarter-mile from the cabin, and the water bucket grew heavier with each step of her return journey. She paused at the rise overlooking their property, if the dilapidated cabin and scrubby plot of land could be called that. In the distance, a cloud of dust signaled riders approaching along the main road. Travelers were uncommon on this stretch, far from the established trails. Curiosity momentarily outweighed caution as she shielded her eyes to see better. 3 men on horseback, moving at an unhurried pace. As they drew closer, she could make out their features. 2 were rough-looking men with unkempt beards and weathered faces that had seen too many hard miles. But it was the third rider who caught her attention. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders covered by a dusty brown duster despite the heat. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but she could see a strong jawline and the glint of light eyes. Unlike his companions, he rode with a quiet confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. Violet quickly looked away when she realized she was staring. Women who stared at strange men invited trouble, as Frank had reminded her with his fists more than once. She hurried back to the cabin, sloshing precious water over the rim of the bucket in her haste. The riders were passing by the turnoff to their property when Frank stirred on the porch. He squinted at the men, then suddenly stood straighter, his face paling beneath his perpetual sunburn. "Get inside," he hissed at Violet, shoving her roughly toward the door. "But the water. Now." His voice cracked like a whip, and she scurried inside, but remained near the window where she could see what was happening. Frank stumbled down the steps, attempting to stand straight as the riders slowed. The leader, the man who had caught Violet's eye, raised his hand in greeting. "Morning," he called, his voice carrying a hint of the South that had been polished by years away from home. "We're looking for the Weaver property. Been told it's somewhere in these parts." Frank shifted nervously. "Ain't no Weavers around here no more. Died of fever last winter, the lot of them." The man exchanged glances with his companions. "That's so? We heard differently in town." "Town folks don't know nothing," Frank spat. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I got work to do." The leader studied Frank for a long moment, then nodded. "Much obliged for your time." His eyes drifted toward the window where Violet stood, and for a moment, their gazes locked. She quickly stepped back into the shadows, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. The riders continued on, and Frank stormed back into the cabin. "Pack your things," he ordered, yanking her meager belongings from the shelf. "We're leaving." "Leaving?" But where his hand struck her cheek with enough force to knock her against the wall. "Don't question me, girl. We're going to your aunt's in New Mexico." "I don't have an aunt in New Mexico," Violet said, confusion momentarily overwhelming her fear. Frank's eyes darted nervously to the window. "We leave at nightfall. And if anyone comes asking, you ain't seen me." Fear coiled in Violet's stomach. Whatever had Frank spooked meant trouble, and trouble for him inevitably meant pain for her. But beneath the fear flickered something else: opportunity. If they were leaving suddenly, she might never have a better chance to escape. As dusk approached, Frank grew increasingly agitated, drinking heavily and pacing the small cabin. Violet quietly gathered what little she could call her own: a dress, a shawl, a small tin containing her mother's wedding ring, and the money from beneath the floorboard. She hid them in a bundle beneath her apron, waiting for the right moment. It came sooner than expected. The sound of approaching hooves sent Frank lunging for a shotgun. "Stay inside," he ordered, his words slurring. "And keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." The moment he stepped onto the porch, Violet moved to the back window. It was a tight fit, but she managed to squeeze through, dropping silently to the hard-packed earth below. The voices from the front of the cabin grew louder, Frank's rising in anger, another man's remaining steady and firm. "Holloway, there's no sense running. We know what you did." A shotgun blast answered the words, followed by shouts and the thunder of return fire. Violet didn't wait to see the outcome. She fled into the growing darkness, her heart pounding in her ears as she ran toward the stand of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed. The sound of gunfire continued behind her, spurring her forward despite the burn in her lungs and the sting of branches whipping against her face. She didn't stop until she reached the creek, collapsing beside it to gulp air into her starved lungs. The night had fully descended now, the moon not yet risen, leaving her in nearly complete darkness. The gunfire had ceased, but she didn't dare return to find out what had happened. Frank might be dead or worse. He might be alive and furious at her escape. Violet followed the creek for nearly an hour before exhaustion forced her to stop. Finding a hollow beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient cottonwood, she curled up, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Tomorrow she would make her way to town and use her savings for that stagecoach ticket. Tonight, for the first time in years, she was free from Frank's cruelty, even if that freedom came with the terrifying uncertainty of being alone in the wilderness. Sleep claimed her eventually, a fitful rest broken by every night sound. The howl of a distant coyote startled her awake just before dawn. As she blinked away the disorientation, a rustling in the brush nearby froze her blood. Slowly, she peered out from her hiding place. A man was kneeling by the creek, filling a canteen. The growing light revealed him to be the rider she'd seen the day before, the one with the steady gaze and broad shoulders. Up close, she could see that his face was handsome in a weathered way, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes despite the serious set of his mouth. A badge glinted on his vest. Violet tried to retreat deeper into her hiding place, but her movement dislodged a stone that clattered down the bank. The man's head snapped up, his hand instantly moving to the revolver at his hip. "Come on out," he called, his voice calm but commanding. "I know you're there." For a moment, Violet considered remaining hidden, but the futility of it was obvious. Slowly, she emerged from beneath the roots, her hands slightly raised to show she carried no weapon. Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. "You're the girl from the cabin." She nodded, warily keeping her distance. "Are you going to take me back?" He studied her, taking in her bruised face and the way she held herself, as if expecting a blow. "That depends. Are you running from the law or from him?" I don't even know who you are, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Samuel Wade, U.S. Marshal. He lowered his gun, sliding it back into its holster. Your father? Stepfather, she corrected quickly. Frank Holloway. Marshal Wade's expression hardened. Frank Holloway is wanted for murder in Texas. Killed a man and his wife during a robbery last year. The words hit Violet like a physical blow. Murder. It explained Frank's reaction to the riders, his insistence on leaving. Had she been living with a murderer all this time? The thought made her stomach turn. I didn't know, she whispered. Wade nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. What's your name? Violet. Violet Keller. She hadn't used her real surname in years, Frank having insisted she take his. Well, Miss Keller, you should know that Frank Holloway won't be hurting anyone else. He chose to shoot rather than surrender last night. Relief and shock warred within her. Frank was dead. The man who had tormented her for years was gone. She should feel something grief, perhaps, or at least solemn acknowledgement, but all she felt was a weightless sensation, as if heavy chains had suddenly fallen away. I see, was all she could manage. Marshal Wade approached slowly, as one might a skittish horse. You're injured. Violet touched her cheek where Frank had struck her, wincing at the tenderness. It's nothing I'm not used to. Something dangerous flashed in Wade's eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. You have family somewhere? Someone who can take you in? She shook her head. I was planning to take the stagecoach east. Find work in one of the bigger towns. It's dangerous for a young woman to travel alone, he said, his tone matter of fact rather than judgmental. More dangerous than staying? She asked quietly. Their eyes met, and understanding passed between them. He knew what kind of life she'd been living. He'd seen the evidence on her face, in the way she flinched at sudden movements. I'm heading to Silver Creek, Wade said after a moment. There's a stagecoach station there with routes east. If you'd like, you can ride with me and my deputies. Suspicion flickered. Men didn't offer help without expecting something in return, not in her experience. Why would you do that? Because it's the decent thing to do, he answered simply. And because I'd sleep better knowing you made it somewhere safe. Violet studied him, trying to detect any hint of deception or ulterior motive. But his gaze remained steady and clear, his hands relaxed at his sides rather than reaching for her. Everything about his posture was designed to appear non-threatening. All right, she finally agreed, survival instinct overriding caution. Traveling with lawmen was safer than traveling alone, and she could always slip away in Silver Creek if necessary. Wade nodded, seemingly pleased with her decision. My camp is just up the ridge. The deputies are preparing breakfast. You're welcome to join us. She followed him at a careful distance, alert for any sign that she'd misjudged the situation. The camp came into view, two men tending a small fire, coffee brewing in a battered pot. They looked up as Wade approached with Violet. Boys, this is Miss Keller, Wade introduced her. She'll be traveling with us to Silver Creek. The deputies nodded respectfully, one of them immediately offering her a tin cup of coffee. Madam, he said, his tone polite but curious. Violet accepted the cup with murmured thanks, wrapping her fingers around the warm metal. The normality of the gesture, being treated like a person worthy of basic courtesy, felt strange after so long under Frank's roof. As they ate a simple breakfast of beans and hardtack, Wade explained that they had been tracking Frank for months after connecting him to the murders in Texas. We lost his trail near El Paso, he told her. Picked it up again last week when a drunk in Tucson mentioned a man matching his description living out this way. He always said he came from California, Violet said quietly. I suppose that was a lie too. Men like Holloway, they're built on lies, the older deputy commented. No offense to you, miss. None taken. She stared into her coffee. He wasn't always the way he was at the end. When my mother was alive, he could be almost kind sometimes. Wade's expression softened slightly. Grief changes people, but it doesn't excuse what he did to that family in Texas, or to you. The acknowledgement of her suffering, spoken so plainly yet without pity, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to show weakness. After breakfast, Wade offered her his horse, while he walked alongside. Violet had ridden before Frank had taught her when she was younger, one of the few useful things he'd done, but she was wary of accepting more kindness. "I can walk," she insisted. "It's 15 miles to Silver Creek," Wade replied. "And you've had a rough night. Please." It wasn't an order, but a genuine request. Reluctantly, she allowed him to help her into the saddle, tensing as his hands circled her waist. But his touch was brief and impersonal, nothing like Frank's rough handling. The journey to Silver Creek took most of the day. As they rode, Violet gradually relaxed in Wade's company. He didn't demand conversation, but answered her occasional questions about his work and the territories he patrolled. There was something reassuring about his steady presence, a calm confidence that made her feel, for the first time in years, that she wasn't in constant danger. Silver Creek emerged from the landscape as the sun began its descent, a dusty collection of wooden buildings straddling the stage road, larger than she'd expected, but still small enough that a stranger would be noticed. "The stage comes through tomorrow heading east," Wade informed her as they approached the town. "We'll get you a ticket and a room at the hotel for tonight." "I can pay for myself," Violet said quickly, her pride stiffening her spine. Wade glanced up at her with a hint of a smile. "I never doubted it, Miss Keller." The town greeted the arrival of the marshal and his deputies with curious stares and a few welcoming calls. Violet kept her eyes lowered, aware of the gossip her presence would generate. A young woman traveling with lawmen was bound to raise questions. The Silver Creek Hotel was a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days, but it appeared clean and well-maintained. Wade helped Violet dismount, his hands strong but gentle on her waist. "Thank you," she said stiffly, still uncomfortable with the attention. Wade merely nodded and led the way inside. The hotel proprietor, a plump woman with sharp eyes, gave Violet an assessing look. "We need 2 rooms," Wade told her. "One for the lady, one for myself and my deputies." "Only got 1 room left," the woman replied. "Got a cattle buyer and his men in town. Took most of my rooms." Wade frowned. "Is there another hotel in town?" "Just the saloon, and that ain't no place for a lady," the woman said, her gaze moving to Violet's bruised face. "Though I suppose you boys could take the room, and the young lady could stay with me in my quarters. Got a spare bed since my daughter married." Relief washed over Violet at the solution. The thought of sharing accommodations with men, even lawmen, had set her heart racing with anxiety. "That would be most kind," she said quickly. The woman, Mrs. Sullivan, as she introduced herself, led Violet to her private rooms behind the hotel kitchen while Wade and his deputies settled their bill. The space was small but homey, with colorful quilts and the scent of lavender in the air. "You get yourself cleaned up," Mrs. Sullivan said, pointing to a washstand in the corner. "There's a dress of my daughter's might fit you. You look about her size." Before Violet could protest, the older woman added, "Don't worry about paying. Marshal Wade already settled up for your board." Irritation flared briefly. She had her own money, had fought and suffered for every cent, but it was quickly tempered by practical considerations. The less she spent now, the more she'd have to start her new life. Left alone, Violet took advantage of the washstand, scrubbing away the dirt of her flight and the lingering sense of Frank's presence. The borrowed dress was plain but clean, a faded blue calico that fit reasonably well despite being slightly loose in the bodice. She was just finishing braiding her damp hair when Mrs. Sullivan returned with a tray of food, a bowl of stew, fresh bread, and a cup of tea. "Marshal asked if you'd join him for supper in the dining room," she said, setting down the tray. "I told him you'd already turned in for the night." Figured you might prefer some peace and quiet after whatever put those marks on you. Violet touched her bruised cheek self-consciously. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan's eyes softened. My first husband had heavy hands too, girl. No shame in running from that. The simple understanding in the woman's voice broke something inside Violet. Tears she'd held back for years suddenly spilled over, her body shaking with silent sobs. Mrs. Sullivan sat beside her on the bed, a weathered hand rubbing gentle circles on her back. Let it out, she murmured. Ain't nobody here to judge you. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Violet felt hollowed out, but somehow lighter. She ate the stew mechanically, surprised to find her appetite returning despite everything. The stage leaves at noon tomorrow, Mrs. Sullivan informed her. Where are you heading? East, Violet replied vaguely. Somewhere I can find honest work. The older woman nodded thoughtfully. My sister runs a boarding house in Denver. Always looking for help. If you're interested, I could write you a letter of introduction. The unexpected kindness left Violet momentarily speechless. Why would you do that for a stranger? Mrs. Sullivan shrugged. Been where you are, like I said. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to extend a hand. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in years, Frank had relegated her to a straw pallet in the corner. Violet stared at the ceiling, her mind whirling with possibilities. Denver. A fresh start, with at least the promise of employment waiting. It seemed too good to be true, which made her wary. Life had taught her that anything seeming too good usually was. But as she drifted toward sleep, it was Marshal Wade's face that filled her thoughts, the gentle way he'd helped her onto his horse, the respect in his voice when he spoke to her. In 20 years of life, she'd rarely encountered a man whose touch didn't bring pain. The novelty of it lingered like a phantom sensation on her skin. Morning brought clarity and renewed determination. Violet rose early, helping Mrs. Sullivan with breakfast preparations as a small way to repay her kindness. The older woman wrote the promised letter of introduction, sealing it with a drop of wax. Martha's strict but fair, she said as she handed over the envelope. Tell her Elizabeth sent you, and she'll see you right. Violet tucked the letter carefully into her bundle of belongings. I don't know how to thank you. Live well, Mrs. Sullivan replied simply. That's thanks enough. When Violet entered the hotel dining room for breakfast, she found Marshal Wade already there, a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood as she approached, his eyes widening slightly at her transformation from the frightened, dirty girl he'd found by the creek. Miss Keller, he greeted her. You look rested. Mrs. Sullivan was very kind, she replied, taking the seat he offered across from him. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Wade spoke again. I've purchased your ticket to Denver. The stage should arrive around noon. Violet set down her fork. I told you I could pay my own way. Consider it restitution, he said. The government offers rewards for wanted men like Holloway. Part of that money should rightfully go toward helping those he harmed. Put that way, it was harder to refuse. Still, Violet wasn't accustomed to accepting charity. I'll pay you back someday. The corner of Wade's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. I have no doubt you're capable of it, Miss Keller. After breakfast, Wade excused himself to attend to some business at the sheriff's office, promising to return before the stage departed. Violet spent the morning helping Mrs. Sullivan around the hotel, finding comfort in the simple routine of physical work. As noon approached, she changed back into her own dress, reluctantly relinquishing the borrowed garment. Her bundle of possessions remained pitifully small, but it contained everything she needed for a fresh start: her mother's ring, her savings, and now, the letter that might lead to employment. Wade met her in the hotel lobby as promised, his deputies flanking him. The stage is running a bit late, he informed her. Sheriff got word it should be here within the hour. They walked together to the stagecoach station, a simple wooden platform beside the general store. A small crowd had gathered, others waiting for the incoming stage. Violet felt exposed under their curious stares, especially standing next to the imposing figure of the Marshal. "Will you return to Texas now?" she asked, more to break the silence than from genuine curiosity. Wade shook his head. "We're headed north to the Montana Territory. Reports of cattle rustlers causing trouble for the ranchers up there." "That's a long journey." "It is." He glanced down at her. "Though not so different from the one you're undertaking." The comparison surprised her. "I'm just going to Denver." "For now," he said. "But I suspect a woman with your courage won't stop there." Courage. No one had ever described her that way before. Stubborn, defiant, troublesome, those were Frank's words for her. But courage implied something noble, something worthy of respect. Before she could formulate a response, the distant rumble of the approaching stagecoach drew their attention. The crowd stirred with anticipation as the cloud of dust on the horizon grew larger. "Miss Keller," Wade said suddenly, his voice low. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of writing to a friend in Denver. Thomas Garrett, he's a lawyer there. If you ever need assistance, he's a good man." Violet looked up at him in surprise. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." His eyes met hers, their blue depths reflecting sincerity. "I wanted to." The stagecoach rolled into town with the clatter of wheels and the snorting of tired horses. Passengers disembarked, stretching cramped limbs and retrieving luggage. The driver called out a 20-minute stop for fresh horses and refreshments. As the departing passengers dispersed, Violet became aware of a commotion near the general store. A red-faced man was shouting at a young boy, his hand raised threateningly. The child cowered, clutching a small package to his chest. "I paid for it fair and square," the boy protested. "You're a thieving little rat," the man snarled, grabbing the boy's collar. "Just like your father." Wade moved instantly, crossing the street in long strides. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Let the boy go." The man turned, his anger momentarily redirected. "This ain't your business, mister." "I'm making it my business." Wade's hand rested casually near his holster, the badge on his chest catching the sunlight. "Now, what seems to be the problem here?" The confrontation diffused quickly once the man realized he was addressing a U.S. Marshal. The dispute was trivial, a misunderstanding over change given for a purchase, but Wade handled it with a calm efficiency that impressed Violet. He didn't raise his voice or resort to threats, yet his presence alone commanded respect. When he returned to her side, she found herself looking at him with new eyes. "You're good at that," she observed. "Making peace." "Sometimes," he acknowledged. "Other times, peace isn't an option." A shadow crossed his face, hinting at darker experiences than the minor dispute they'd just witnessed. The stagecoach driver called for boarding. Violet's heart raced as the moment of departure approached. Denver was still an unknown quantity, Mrs. Sullivan's sister a stranger despite the letter of introduction. But the alternative, staying, wasn't really an option. There was nothing for her in Silver Creek. Wade helped load her small bundle onto the coach, then turned to her with an outstretched hand. "Safe travels, Miss Keller." Hesitantly, she placed her hand in his. Instead of shaking it as she expected, he simply held it for a moment, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. The gesture was so gentle, so unexpected, that Violet felt her breath catch. "Thank you," she whispered, the words encompassing far more than just his assistance with her luggage. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their different paths. Then the driver called the final boarding, breaking the spell. Violet climbed into the coach, settling on the hard wooden seat between a plump older woman and a traveling salesman. As the driver cracked his whip and the horses lurched forward, she looked back through the small window. Wade stood watching, his tall figure unmistakable among the dispersing crowd. He raised his hand in farewell, and she found herself returning the gesture until the coach rounded a bend and he disappeared from view. The journey to Denver took 3 days of hard travel, bone-jarring rides punctuated by brief stops at waypoints and nights spent in rustic stagecoach stations. Violet kept to herself, deflecting curious questions with polite but vague responses. The fewer people who knew her business, the better. Denver emerged from the landscape on the afternoon of the third day, a sprawling city nestled against the backdrop of mountains. It was larger than Violet had imagined, with brick buildings stretching several stories high and streets teeming with more people than she'd ever seen in one place. Martha Sullivan's boarding house was located in a respectable neighborhood not far from the business district, a 3-story structure with a wide porch and clean windows. Violet approached the front door with trepidation, Elizabeth's letter clutched in her hand like a talisman. Martha proved to be a taller, thinner version of her sister, with the same sharp eyes but a more severe mouth. She read Elizabeth's letter in silence, occasionally glancing up to study Violet with undisguised assessment. "My sister says you're running from trouble," she finally said, folding the letter precisely. "I don't tolerate trouble in my house." "The trouble is dead," Violet replied evenly. "I'm looking for honest work and a fresh start." Martha's expression softened marginally. "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam." "Clean?" "Mend." Violet nodded. "I can do laundry, too. And I learn quickly." After a moment's consideration, Martha nodded. "I need help with the cooking and cleaning. Room and board plus $3 a week. You'll have Sundays off after church service. No gentlemen callers in your room. No drinking, no gambling." The terms were better than Violet had dare hope for. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. I accept." Martha, the older woman, corrected. "Can't have 2 Mrs. Sullivans confusing the boarders." She led Violet up 2 flights of stairs to a small but clean attic room. "Get yourself settled. Dinner's at 6 sharp. You can observe tonight and start helping tomorrow." Left alone, Violet sat on the narrow bed, overwhelmed by the swift change in her circumstances. A week ago, she'd been enduring Frank's cruelty with no end in sight. Now she was in Denver, with a roof over her head and employment secured. It seemed almost miraculous. As she unpacked her few belongings, her fingers brushed against the slip of paper Marshal Wade had pressed into her hand at the last moment, the address of his lawyer friend, Thomas Garrett. She traced the neat handwriting, remembering the gentle touch of Wade's thumb across her knuckles. It had been such a small gesture, yet it lingered in her memory like a warm ember. Life at the boarding house quickly settled into a routine. Violet rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the 12 boarders, mostly single men who worked in Denver's businesses and offices. She served meals, cleaned rooms, did laundry, and assisted Martha with the endless tasks of running the establishment. The work was hard but satisfying. For the first time, her efforts were acknowledged with thanks rather than criticism. Martha was strict but fair, just as Elizabeth had promised, and she seemed pleased with Violet's diligence. 2 months passed, and Violet began to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since her mother died. Her savings grew steadily, tucked away in a tin box beneath her mattress. The bruises Frank had left faded, though sometimes she still woke in the night, heart pounding from dreams where he found her and dragged her back to that isolated cabin. Denver in autumn was beautiful, the changing leaves painting the city in gold and crimson. On her Sunday afternoons off, Violet took to exploring, gradually expanding her knowledge of the city beyond the few blocks around the boarding house. She was returning from one such excursion, a small package of ribbon clutched in her hand, her first frivolous purchase in years, when she noticed a well-dressed man standing on the boarding house porch, consulting a pocket watch. As she approached, he looked up, his expression shifting from impatience to interest. He was middle-aged, with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Excuse me," she said, moving past him to the door. "Miss Keller," he asked, stopping her in her tracks. Violet turned slowly, wariness replacing her casual demeanor. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, revealing even white teeth. "Thomas Garrett, madam. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in Marshal Samuel Wade." Her heart skipped at the mention of Wade's name. "Yes, we do." Garrett extended his hand. "I've been meaning to call on you since I received Sam's letter, but a case took me to California for several weeks. I only just returned." Violet hesitantly shook his hand, surprised by the formality of the gesture. Few men treated working women with such courtesy. "Marshal Wade was very kind to me." "He mentioned that," Garrett replied. Though knowing Sam, he probably downplayed his role considerably. She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply asked, "Would you like to come in for tea, Mr. Garrett? Martha, Mrs. Sullivan, should be in the kitchen." Over tea in the boarding house parlor, with Martha's silent but watchful presence ensuring propriety, Garrett explained that Wade had written to him about Violet's situation and asked him to check on her welfare. "Sam doesn't usually involve himself in the lives of those he encounters in his work," Garrett remarked, stirring sugar into his tea. "The fact that he did so in your case speaks volumes." Violet felt a flush rising to her cheeks. "He helped me when I needed it most." "I'm grateful." "I'm glad to see you've found a good situation," Garrett continued. "Mrs. Sullivan runs a respectable establishment by all accounts." "She's been very fair to me," Violet agreed, glancing at Martha, who had relaxed slightly at the lawyer's obvious approval. As Garrett prepared to leave, he handed Violet a small card with his office address embossed in elegant script. "If you ever need legal assistance or simply advice, my door is open to you, Miss Keller. Any friend of Sam Wade's is a friend of mine." After he departed, Martha raised an eyebrow at Violet. "A U.S. Marshal and now a prominent lawyer. You keep interesting company for a girl who arrived with nothing but a bundle of clothes." Violet tucked Garrett's card into her pocket. "It's a long story." "I imagine it is," Martha replied, her tone softer than usual. "Well, whatever brought you here, I'm glad of it. You're a good worker, Violet. I'd hate to lose you to some fancy position Mr. Garrett might offer." The unexpected compliment warmed Violet more than she cared to admit. "I have no plans to leave, Martha. I like it here." Life continued its steady rhythm through the winter. Thomas Garrett became an occasional visitor to the boarding house, sometimes bringing books he thought might interest Violet. Through their conversations, she gradually improved her limited education, discovering a love for reading that had been dormant since her mother's death. Spring arrived with a burst of activity in Denver. The city seemed to shake off its winter lethargy, streets bustling with increased traffic and new faces. The boarding house was consistently full, keeping Violet and Martha busier than ever. One evening in late April, as Violet was serving dinner to the boarders, Martha appeared at her elbow. "There's someone asking for you at the door," she murmured. "A man." Alarm flickered briefly, old fears died hard, but Violet reminded herself that Frank was dead. "Did he give a name?" Martha shook her head. "Just asked if Violet Keller was still in residence. Tall fellow, wearing a badge." Violet nearly dropped the platter of roast beef she was holding. "Excuse me," she said to the waiting boarders, passing the platter to Martha with hands that suddenly trembled. She moved through the house in a daze, her heart racing. It couldn't be. And yet, as she opened the front door, there he stood, Samuel Wade, looking travel-worn but somehow even more handsome than she remembered. "Miss Keller," he said, removing his hat. "I hope I'm not intruding." Violet stared at him, momentarily speechless. The memory of him had been vivid in her mind for months, but the reality was something else entirely. The breadth of his shoulders, the warmth in his blue eyes, the quiet strength in his stance. "Marshal Wade," she finally managed. "This is unexpected." A hint of uncertainty crossed his face. "I was passing through Denver on my way back from Montana. Thought I'd see how you were faring." I'm well, she said, finding her composure. Very well, in fact. Please come in. She led him to the parlor, acutely aware of his presence behind her. Memories of their brief time together came flooding back, his gentle hands helping her onto his horse, his calm voice diffusing tension, the warmth of his fingers against hers as they said goodbye. Thomas Garrett told me you'd found employment here, Wade said as they sat in the parlor's straight-back chairs. Said Mrs. Sullivan speaks highly of you. Martha has been very kind, Violet replied. The work suits me. Wade nodded, his eyes taking in the modest but comfortable surroundings. You look different. Self-consciously, Violet touched her hair, which was neatly styled rather than hastily braided as it had been when they last met. Her dress, while simple, was new and properly fitted. I suppose I am different in many ways. It suits you, he said softly. This new life. Something in his tone made her heart flutter. How long will you be in Denver? Just tonight. I'm due in Santa Fe by the end of the week. He hesitated, then added, though I could delay a day, perhaps, if there was reason to. The implication hung in the air between them. Violet found herself wanting to give him that reason, though she hardly knew why. Their acquaintance had been brief, their interaction limited to a time of crisis in her life. Yet something about Samuel Wade had stayed with her through the months of separation. I have tomorrow afternoon free, she said, surprising herself with her boldness. Perhaps you might show me more of Denver? I haven't ventured far from this neighborhood on my own. The smile that lit his face sent a warm current through her veins. I'd be honored, Miss Keller. They arranged to meet the following afternoon, and Wade departed shortly after, needing to secure lodging for the night. As Violet returned to her duties, helping Martha serve dessert to the impatient boarders, she felt a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. Martha cornered her in the kitchen later that evening. So that's him, is it? The marshal who helped you? Violet nodded, focusing intently on drying the dinner plates. Handsome man, Martha observed. And he came all this way just to check on you. He was passing through, Violet corrected, though Wade's words suggested his detour to Denver had been intentional rather than convenient. Martha made a skeptical sound. Men like that don't pass through anywhere without purpose, girl. He came to see you. The thought brought both excitement and trepidation. Violet had deliberately avoided entanglements with men since arriving in Denver, despite several boarders showing interest. The memory of Frank's brutality was still too fresh, the fear of finding herself trapped again too strong. But Samuel Wade was different. From their first meeting, he had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. His touch had been gentle, his words considerate. If any man could help her overcome her fear of masculine attention, perhaps it was him. The next day dawned clear and warm, a perfect spring afternoon. Violet dressed with more care than usual, selecting her best dress, a dark blue calico with white trim that Martha had helped her make during the winter evenings. She pinned her hair up in a simple but flattering style, and for the first time since arriving in Denver, used a touch of the rose-scented water Thomas Garrett had given her as a Christmas gift. Wade arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, looking refreshed from his journey and striking in a clean shirt and vest, his badge polished to a shine. His eyes widened appreciatively as Violet descended the stairs to meet him. Miss Keller, he greeted her. You look lovely. The compliment brought color to her cheeks. Thank you, Marshal. Samuel, please, he said as he offered his arm. Or Sam, if you prefer. We're not in an official capacity today. The intimacy of using his given name felt significant somehow. Then you must call me Violet. Denver on a spring afternoon was vibrant with activity. Wade Samuel proved to be an attentive guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing interesting facts about the city's history. They strolled through a small park, visited a bookshop where he insisted on purchasing a volume of poetry she had admired, and eventually found themselves at a cafe with small tables set on a patio overlooking the street. Over tea and pastries, their conversation deepened beyond pleasantries. Violet found herself telling him about her life at the boarding house, her growing friendship with Martha, her newfound love of reading. "You've built a good life here," Samuel observed.
I'm glad.
"It wouldn't have been possible without your help," she replied. "I never properly thanked you for that." He shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks, Violet. You're the one who had the courage to leave, to start fresh. I just provided a small assist along the way." "It didn't feel small to me," she said softly. "It felt like salvation." Their eyes met across the table, and something electric passed between them. Samuel's hand moved across the tablecloth, his fingers lightly touching hers in a gesture reminiscent of their parting in Silver Creek. "I've thought about you," he admitted, his voice low. "More than is probably proper for a man in my position." Violet's heart raced at the confession. "I've thought of you too." His fingers closed gently around hers. "I told myself I was just passing through, that checking on your welfare was a professional courtesy. But that's not the whole truth." "What is the truth?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. "The truth is, I wanted to see you again." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "From the moment I found you by that creek, there was something about you that stayed with me. Your strength, your dignity despite everything you'd endured." Violet swallowed hard, overwhelmed by his words and the sincerity behind them. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Samuel assured her. "I know this is unexpected. I just needed you to know." They walked back to the boarding house in a charged silence, both processing the shift in their relationship. At the front steps, Samuel paused. "I leave for Santa Fe tomorrow," he said. "But I'll be back through Denver in about a month, if you permit me to call on you then." Violet looked up at him, this man who had shown her that not all masculine touches brought pain, that not all male attention was threatening. "I'd like that very much." He took her hand, raising it slowly to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply affecting. The gentle press of his mouth against her knuckles sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. "Until then, Violet Keller," he murmured. She watched him walk away, his tall figure straight and steady among the afternoon crowd. Something new had taken root inside her, a fragile hope that perhaps there could be more to her future than simply surviving. True to his word, Samuel returned to Denver a month later. His visit coincided with Violet's day off, and they spent a pleasant afternoon exploring a different part of the city. This time, their conversation flowed more easily, the initial awkwardness replaced by a growing comfort in each other's company. As spring turned to summer, Samuel's visits became more regular once a month, sometimes twice if his duties brought him through Colorado. Each time, Violet found herself more drawn to him, more appreciative of his steady presence and respectful manner. Martha observed the developing relationship with a mixture of approval and concern. "He seems a good man," she remarked after Samuel's fourth visit. "But his work takes him all over the territories." That's a hard life for a woman to share. Violet had considered this herself. "We're just friends, Martha." The older woman raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Friends don't look at each other the way you two do. Just be careful with your heart, girl. Even good men can break it without meaning to." By August, Samuel's intentions had become clear. During a picnic in the hills outside Denver, he spoke of his feelings directly. "I care for you, Violet," he said, his eyes serious. "More than I've cared for anyone in a long time. I know my life isn't settled, that my work takes me away for weeks at a time. But I find myself thinking of you wherever I go, wishing you were with me." Violet's heart soared at his words, even as caution held her back. "I care for you too, Samuel. But I've only just found my footing here, my independence. I'm not sure I'm ready to give that up." He took her hand, his touch as gentle as always. "I would never ask you to give up your independence. It's one of the things I admire most about you. I'm simply asking if there might be room in your life for me, as there is in mine for you." The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. This was so different from what she had known with Frank, not possession or control, but partnership and respect. I think there could be, she admitted softly. With time. Samuel's smile was like the sunrise. Time is something I'm willing to give, Violet. As much as you need. Their courtship progressed slowly through the autumn, each visit deepening their connection. Samuel wrote when he was away, letters that Violet treasured and read until the paper grew thin from handling. He told her of his work, the places he traveled, the people he met. But mostly, he wrote of his feelings for her, his admiration for her resilience, his appreciation of her gentle spirit, his hope for their future together. In November, during a visit that coincided with the first snowfall of the season, Samuel proposed. They were walking back to the boarding house after dinner at a small restaurant, snowflakes drifting lazily around them. He stopped suddenly, turning to face her. "Violet," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. Every time I leave Denver, I count the days until I can return to you." Her heart raced as she recognized the seriousness in his expression. "I know it hasn't been long," he continued, taking both her hands in his. "And I know your past makes you cautious. But I love you, Violet Keller. I love your strength, your kindness, your quiet dignity. I want to spend my life showing you that love, if you'll let me." Tears filled her eyes as he dropped to one knee in the gathering snow. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, old fears threatened to overwhelm her memories of Frank's cruelty, of pain disguised as love. But Samuel wasn't Frank. His hands had never brought her anything but gentleness, his words nothing but respect. "Yes," she whispered, her voice strengthening as she repeated, "Yes, Samuel. I'll marry you." His smile was radiant as he rose, drawing her into his arms with the same careful tenderness he'd always shown. When his lips met hers for the first time, Violet felt the last of her defenses crumbling. This was what love should feel like: warm, safe, cherished. They were married in Denver on Christmas Eve, a small ceremony with Martha Sullivan and Thomas Garrett as witnesses. Violet wore a simple cream-colored dress that Martha had helped her make, with a sprig of holly in her hair instead of a veil. Samuel, resplendent in a new suit, looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever beheld. "I promise to cherish you," he vowed, his voice steady and clear. "To respect you as my equal, to protect you with my life, and to love you with all that I am, for as long as I live." Violet's own vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. "I promise to stand beside you, to support you in all things, to trust in your goodness, and to love you completely, today and always." As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Samuel had purchased in Santa Fe, Violet marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terrified girl fleeing Frank's brutality to the woman standing proudly beside the man she loved, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. Samuel had arranged for them to spend their honeymoon in a small cabin outside Denver, a wedding gift from Thomas Garrett, who owned the property but rarely used it. As their carriage approached through the snowy landscape, Violet felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The cabin was cozy and welcoming, with a fire already burning in the hearth and supplies stocked for their week-long stay. Samuel carried their bags inside, then returned to the carriage to pay the driver. When he came back, he found Violet standing by the fire, her expression thoughtful. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently, closing the door against the cold. She turned to him with a small smile.
"No, just
remembering how far I've come." Samuel crossed to her, his movements unhurried. "You've come farther than most could have with what you faced. Because of you," she said softly. He shook his head.
"No, Violet."
"Because of your own strength. I just had the good fortune to witness it." His hand came up to cup her cheek, the touch feather-light. "I meant what I promised today. I will never hurt you. Never." The tenderness in his eyes made her throat tight with emotion. "I know." When he kissed her, it was with the same gentle care he'd always shown, but there was a new heat behind it, a passion tempered by respect for her boundaries. Violet found herself responding with a fervor that surprised her, her arms winding around his neck to draw him closer. Their first night together as husband and wife became a revelation for Violet. Samuel's hands, so capable in his work as a lawman, proved equally skilled in showing her pleasure she'd never imagined possible. Each touch was a question, each caress seeking permission before proceeding. He guided her with patient tenderness through territory that had previously been associated only with pain and degradation in her mind. "You are so beautiful," he whispered against her skin. "So perfect." In his arms, Violet discovered that physical intimacy could be a communion rather than a conquest, a giving rather than a taking. When they finally joined as one, the experience bore no resemblance to the brutality she had known with Frank. This was something else entirely, a sacred connection, a mutual surrender. Afterward, lying in the circle of Samuel's arms with the fire casting golden light across the bed, Violet felt a peace she'd never known before. "Are you all right?" he asked, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. She smiled up at him, tears of happiness pricking her eyes. "More than all right. I never knew it could be like this." His expression grew solemn. "It always should have been. What he did to you, that wasn't love, Violet. It wasn't even desire. It was control and cruelty." "I know that now," she said, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "You've shown me what love truly is, Samuel. Not just tonight, but from the first moment your hands touched mine without hurting me." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "And I'll spend the rest of my life showing you. Every day." Their honeymoon week passed in a blissful haze of discovery and connection. They talked for hours by the fire, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their future. Samuel spoke of his childhood in Georgia, his service in the Union Army during the war, his decision to become a lawman afterward. Violet told him more about her mother, the happy years before her death, and her hopes of someday creating the same loving home for children of her own. "Would you want that?" she asked hesitantly one evening as they lay entwined before the hearth. "Children, I mean." Samuel's smile was warm as he rested his hand on her waist. "With you? Nothing would make me happier." The practical realities of their married life took shape as their honeymoon ended. Samuel had secured a small house in Denver as a base, though his work would still require regular travel throughout the territories. Violet would maintain their home and continue working part-time at Martha's boarding house until they started a family. "I don't want you to feel isolated when I'm away," Samuel said as they discussed the arrangements. "The boarding house gives you community, purpose." His understanding of her needs only deepened Violet's love for him. This was a true partnership, not the ownership Frank had claimed over her. As winter gave way to spring, Violet settled into her new life as Mrs. Wade with a happiness that sometimes seemed too perfect to be real. The small house became a home under her care, and the days when Samuel was away grew easier to bear with the knowledge that he would always return to her. In April, as the first anniversary of their meeting approached, Violet received news that changed everything. The doctor confirmed what she had begun to suspect: she was expecting their first child. She waited until Samuel returned from his latest assignment, greeting him at the door with barely contained excitement. "What is it?" he asked, recognizing the special glow in her eyes as he hung up his hat. "You look like you're about to burst with a secret." Violet took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "Not just a secret, a miracle." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a joy so pure it took her breath away. "A baby? We're having a baby?" She nodded, laughing as he lifted her in a gentle embrace, spinning her around the entryway of their home. "When?" he asked, setting her carefully on her feet. "November, the doctor thinks." Around Thanksgiving, Samuel kissed her with reverent tenderness. I'll speak to my superiors tomorrow. Request a more permanent posting here in Denver, at least until after the baby comes. Can you do that? Violet asked, knowing how important his work was to him. For you and our child, I'd do anything. His hand rested protectively over hers on her abdomen. This family is my priority, Violet. Always. The months of pregnancy brought a deepening of their bond as they prepared for parenthood. Samuel kept his word, arranging for administrative duties in Denver that allowed him to be home each night. He became even more protective of Violet, his touches impossibly gentle as her body changed to accommodate their growing child. On a crisp November evening, after a day and night of labor, Violet gave birth to a healthy daughter. Samuel, who had refused to leave her side throughout the ordeal, wept unashamedly as the midwife placed the infant in his arms. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully transferring the tiny bundle to Violet's waiting embrace. "Just like her mother." They named her Elizabeth, after the woman whose kindness had helped set Violet on her path to happiness. As Violet cradled her daughter, marveling at the tiny fingers and rosebud mouth, she felt the circle of her life completing. From the abused, terrified girl she had been to this moment of pure joy, the journey seemed almost impossible. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, sitting beside her on the bed, his arms supporting her tired shoulders. Violet looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "I was thinking about hands," she said softly. "How yours were the first to show me that touch could heal instead of hurt. And now they'll help shape our daughter's life, teaching her what love truly means." Samuel pressed a kiss to her temple, then to their daughter's downy head. "Our hands together," he murmured, "building a family based on gentleness and respect." As baby Elizabeth drifted to sleep in her arms, Violet leaned against her husband's steady strength, profoundly grateful for the path that had brought her here. The cruelty of her past had not defined her. Instead, it had led her to this moment of perfect belonging, this sanctuary of love that she and Samuel had created together. In the gentle cradle of his arms, surrounded by the family they were building, Violet knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her home.